Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. So I'm not actually at home right now, which you can probably tell. I'm doing a little staycation at a hotel, but I still wanted to go ahead and record a video about the books that I read in the month of March. If you're new here, welcome to my YouTube channel. I make videos about the books that I read, so if that's interesting to you, please feel free to hit subscribe. The first book I'm going to talk about is called Know My Name by Chanel Miller. This is a memoir, and Chanel was unknown for many years. She was known only as Emily Doe in a sexual assault case that took place on Stanford's campus. And the perpetrator was a Stanford student who was also a swimmer. And it was really high profile because of the light sentence that the perpetrator got, and also, as you'll find from reading this memoir, just kind of all the ways the system is really unfair and doesn't provide a lot of dignity for survivors of sexual assault. Chanel is an amazing writer. She has a voice that's very vulnerable yet strong, and this is really the story of her life, but also focused around this traumatic event. But what I mean by that is you still get a lot of her personality, and her voice really shines through, which I think makes it just such a powerful memoir to read, especially given the subject matter. It's also a very strong statement on how the criminal justice system in the US handles sexual assault cases. And Chanel's case, there was a lot of media scrutiny, and it also came up during her trial around how much alcohol she had consumed the night of her assault. And so a lot of victim blaming and just really messed up opinions came out throughout the course of this trial. And Chanel is able to recount, because she was feeling all this and suffering through it, but most of the world didn't know who she was. And so she's able to recount in this memoir just all of the trauma and the healing process that she went through, both recovering from her assault and also just making it through the case against Brock Turner. She definitely does a good job of using her personal experience to highlight kind of the contradictions and the ironies of how the system, it doesn't have victims' best interests at heart. And so even though it was really gut-wrenching and painful almost to have to relive this experience through her eyes, there's also a very strong message of hope and advocacy and the need for change that I appreciated. I would say I wouldn't say it's graphic, but I would say the subject matter is very raw, and the way she writes about it is very raw, and I definitely cried a lot and felt some pain, so maybe a bit of a content warning if that's not something that you really can handle right now. But I definitely recommend this book. I think for a rating, I would rate it a 4.5 out of 5. Really opened my eyes to kind of the injustice that a lot of sexual assault survivors face in the United States. Chanel's case wasn't even that, I mean, not that we need to compare, but it wasn't even that horrible, and she still just has so many scars and wounds from experiencing that. And so you can only imagine a situation where you didn't have a great prosecutor on your side, where you didn't have a good experience with the police officers, and how that could just make it even more horrible for victims. The next book I want to talk about is actually a collection of poetry. It's called We Make Spaces Divine, written by Pooja Nansi, and this was my Singapore Book of the Month. So Pooja is a local educator and poet, and this entire collection really revolves around the theme of identity and belonging, and there are a lot of messages that really resonated with me, even though she comes from the experience of a Singaporean Indian. Or, I don't know, one of the key poems that I really enjoyed was an imagined interaction between someone asking, where are you from? And Pooja having to continually answer because he's not satisfied with what she's telling him. And so eventually she has to go through like her entire family history and how she doesn't actually identify as Gujarati Singaporean because those people have been in Singapore for many, many, many years and many decades, whereas her family came to Singapore more recently. So anyway, given that Singapore has such a history of migration and immigrants, both old waves and new waves, I feel that this is a really fitting collection to kind of dig into those feelings of, will I ever belong in Singapore, and what does it mean to feel a strong connection to a place that doesn't necessarily call you their own. She has a really colloquial style. You can tell that she loves hip hop and kind of music verses, and so I would say her poems are less focused on kind of fussy artistry and more focused on kind of the emotion. They're really easy to read, they're really easy to speak aloud, and they have kind of that free-flowing, natural, almost prose-like feel to them. I also think they're very poignant in some places, especially how she kind of pokes at this idea of it doesn't matter what other people identify me as, like I am who I am. And she really kind of digs into a lot of personal experiences, formative experiences, and her joys and her hobbies she'll reference in various poems that really make this a very personal collection. But the through line is definitely that idea of like, what does it mean to belong in Singapore? And she definitely calls out a lot of microaggressions and racism towards Indians in Singapore. One of my favorite poems is called Mustafa Center, a Fact Sheet, and it talks about the original owner of Mustafa Center, which is a really well-known 24/7 mall in Little India. And the owner was born in India but moved to Singapore when he was 4 years old, and she kind of makes the point that even though he's so successful, or kind of how he was highlighted by the Singapore government as a foreigner that contributed because he was so successful from these humble beginnings of just a stall that was selling things on the street to now this megaplex that's really well known and tourists come to Singapore to visit. And how that welcome is almost conditional on how much you can prove yourself and what you can contribute to a country. But then when he has to move Mustafa Center because the space that he's leased is being redeveloped, someone asks him, oh, are you upset about this? And he said, what's there to be upset about a place that you never owned in the first place? And so she's really toying with that idea that no matter how successful you are or how long you've lived in Singapore, even the subjects themselves don't necessarily know what to call home. And if they themselves don't really feel that sense of belonging, it kind of leads to a lot of like questioning. But I think the answer that Pooja lands on is her experiences, her laughter, her tears, her joy, her sadness. Like these are the things that make her who she is, and the places that she loves in Singapore provide that belonging for her. So I definitely would recommend this, especially if you want to give some local poetry a try. I found it really easy to consume and just kind of a breath of fresh air. I felt like maybe not all these poems are for me, like maybe they're more for people that see themselves in Pooja's experience, but I still could take away a lot from reading the poems. So I will give this a 4.6 out of 5. The last book I'm going to talk about is called Minor Feelings by Cathy Park Hong. The subtitle is A Reckoning on Race in the Asian Condition. Cathy Park Hong is a poet and a writer. You can really tell that from the language in this book. Everything is crafted so well. It's really punchy. I just love the language. She really has a strong grasp on how to use her words for effect and impact. And this is a series of essays that delves into a lot of her own reckoning with what it means to be Asian American. And I don't identify as Asian American, but I wanted to read this just because I feel adjacent to that experience, and it's something I'm interested in and kind of wanted to learn more about, almost from like a third party point of view. And I think this book really does the trick. And in particular, I really liked it because it comes from a very philosophical and artistic grounding. And what I mean by that is Cathy Park Hong has a lot of kind of foundation in almost like the poet's lens into these topics. And so it's not a political appraisal, although she does kind of have to refer to politics, and it's not a historical review. It really comes from her perspective as an artist and a poet, and her relationships with other Asian American artists, and also kind of living in that community, which I really appreciated because that's something that I find interesting and that I find meaningful. I wanted to read a couple quotes. She really just does a lot of reflection on the status of Asian Americans in the US and how there hasn't been a cohesive identity around that. And also there's just so much variation in that experience as opposed to, say, like the African American experience, or even Japanese American, Vietnamese American, Hmong American. To say Asian American encaptures everyone from like a very well-to-do immigrant from India to a refugee from Southeast Asia. So that's also something that she kind of tangles with in these essays is, can we even use that label, and what does it mean to try and create a political identity around that? But she does have a lot of really compelling descriptions of the Asian American experience. For example, she says, Asians lack presence. Asians take up apologetic space. We don't even have enough presence to be considered real minorities. We're not racial enough to be token. We're so post-racial, we're silicon. And that's kind of what Minor Feelings is referring to, which is having a very racialized experience, as Asian Americans do, because they definitely face a set of problems and a lived reality that white Americans do not, but then being told that these feelings are inconsequential or not valid, or you're imagining it. And so that builds into a sense of resentment and self-hate. The self-hating Asian is something she talks about, and it's something that she definitely struggles with. And a corollary to the self-hating Asian is also kind of being co-opted by white supremacy, and how Asian Americans are often thought of as like second in line before blacks and after whites, and how a lot of Asian Americans face this pressure both as immigrants to prove themselves worthy of being in the US, but also in a capitalist society to kind of maintain the status quo and to be used as a wedge, either as a wedge against other racial minorities in the US, or as kind of the model minority myth, which can be really damaging as well. And then the other point she makes is just the pain of being ignored. And so it's not even that Asian Americans are used proactively as that wedge, but more just they become subsumed into this greater like whiteness, white privilege, and are kind of like the sidekicks or like the henchmen to the racial framework in the US. So those are kind of some of the main topics that she talks about. She also does a bit of memoir work, and she reflects on like formative female friendships in her life, and an artist that she herself really admires, who was raped and murdered. She's a Korean artist. She explores a little bit the connection that she has and that she sees in this artist's work. And I really think that because she has such a strong voice and such a good grasp of language, that's what makes this collection of essays really impactful. The way that she describes things is just very touching. Like, it will really kind of cut through and make you see things differently. I don't think she has any conclusions. She doesn't have any like grand theses, and she does kind of struggle a bit when it comes to, I think she does kind of collapse the entire spectrum of Asian American experiences into one that is Korean American, which she does recognize herself. Like, she does call that out, and she does say that there is such a variety of Asian American experiences, but it's less to canonize or provide a framework or to provide suggestions or recommendations, and much more just her reflection of her own experiences and the way that she describes it and the way that she composes these reflections are really insightful, and so I do think they're worth taking a read. I will give this a 4.8 out of 5. I think it does really offer something new, and I really enjoy kind of going along for the ride and seeing Cathy Park Hong's perspective and really feeling her feelings. It's a very visceral and personal set of essays that I don't think will apply to every Asian American, but definitely has some key points that are extremely trenchant about what it means to be Asian American in the US today and in the past 50 years. Thanks so much for watching this video, guys, and stay tuned for our April books review. Again, if you found this interesting or you like the books that I've read, especially if you've read any of these books, please leave a comment down below and let me know what you thought, if you agreed, disagreed, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.